The King Nothing Bobber, man, I look back at that build and it was special for a multitude of reasons, but it was also a lot of stress, and it took a lot to have that build come together. I was invited to Born Free Tin for that build, and so that was something in itself. That was the first year I was invited as an invited builder. And then it was the first time in my life that I kind of had an opportunity to say, all right, I'm actually going to try to, build a knuckle. And for anybody that knows the knuckle game, super expensive, super hard to find. And it was like, all right, so I'm just going to have to jump down this path and see what happens. I always wanted to build this really cool bike that had this like cool 60s chopper vibe, but yet was handcrafted. So I ended up finding the motor on an eBay auction. I did know that the motor wasn't perfect. I did know the cases were empty, and so I was like, all right, this is the only one I could find at the time, so I pulled the trigger on it. The motor shows up, and of course, the cases had damage. One of the jugs was wrong, and so I was like, all right, we'll slowly start going down this path. But I wanted it to be original. I had a lot of buddies at the time that were really into chopper parts. I reached out to a couple of my big hitter friends, and I was able to source these parts and really start getting it going. My buddy Rad Brad, he came through and got the I-beam Springer, and we changed and kind of did some trades, and I got the Springer, and I was like, all right, the stage is kind of set. My buddy from the Light Asylum showed me these amazing headlights he was getting from Europe. I was able to get a tail light and a headlight for him that really kind of pulled together that. And then I was at a swap meet up in Colorado, and I got this pile of knucklehead primary parts and was able to kind of piece all that together too. And so the path with it started really coming together of, man, it's got this feeling of rowdy, it's tough as nails, but it also, if you look at it, a lot of people recognize, oh, that's a Harley brake, that's a Harley primary, this is real knucklehead stuff from that era. So the fabrication on this bike pushed me a lot. I really wanted to do fine metal work with. I wanted it to be very, very detailed. And I was really, in that moment, really getting into bead rolling and experimenting with it. And I really wanted to do some intense stuff that kind of pulled through on the tank, the seat, and the rear fender. And doing that tank was a nightmare. I had to build two of the halves. I had to do the bead rolling to get the outside of the wing. Then I had to have the inner piece that had to be bead rolled with the detail of the wing, and then welding it all together, then putting the tank together. So at that point, I thought, man, this is intense enough that I need to pull it all through. And so the seat was 3 different pieces of metal that I had to have 3 different patterns of bead rolling. Then all the seat had to clip together, and then I had to rivet the whole seat together. And then it's like, well, now what am I gonna do with the rear fender? So I had to make another piece there that had a 2-step integration of the bead rolling. It was a really cool experience pushing myself with some of this tooling that's out there. And then I didn't stop at that point either. Around the primary, I made a piece of brass that had 2 beads on the outside of it. I had to wrap that around it, make a circle, which I've never done before, get that all to fit. Plus that piece is spinning because it's a clutch, so it can't fly off and kill somebody. And so it was a really intense bike on the fab overall. And I was really happy with how it turned out. And I think these are the things as a builder, always trying to push yourself and always trying to level up is an important thing. And I feel like this bike definitely pushed my skill set a little bit. As the bike was coming together, Born Free was approaching and getting closer and closer, and it was time to make that journey. Midnight before the show, I'm just like trying to get everything together. Last minute as always, and threw it in the truck, and we drove down, me, my wife, had the boy with me on this trip. Being in that circle of builders, experiencing that feeling, it was like nothing I've ever experienced before in the chopper world. I was lucky enough to get Revolution magazine to shoot it on site. That bike's been another special one. I've rode it all over the place. It's been a bike from the West Coast to the Midwest to the East Coast that it's kind of followed my journey and followed my path with me. So the King Nothing, that was something for the bike that I wanted to feel like it once there was a heyday. When this bike had its time, it was this powerful king. It had this throne. It was a leader of something. And not so much anymore. He's still a king, but he doesn't have that. He's been through battle. He's been through war. He's been beat up a little bit, but that name will always live on. And that's kind of how I felt like the bike was, and that's kind of how I felt like the Knucklehead Harley. So you get these bikes done, and it's always a wild thing that you created this piece, but then you get to go ride it. And it's so wild when you build old school choppers like this too, because You got a foot clutch bike, you have no front brake, the motor's just right there, everything's super exposed. The vibration, the sound of the bike, the rattling of the clutch, it's just this magical thing to me. Having to kick it over, some days are good, some days are horrible, you know, and that's part of vintage Harley, part of vintage bikes and just that life that I love. And it's not a super easy bike to ride, and there's some sketchiness involved when you build these choppers. And for me, being my personal bike, I'm really hoping this is something that will just live on in my family as an heirloom. My son can have one day, he can experience riding it, passing it down to his son. You know, I would love for this bike and my family to really live on past me and the experiences I've had with it.